Don't know.
That's a lie.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Oh, Desiree,
Yes.
I did
I
sign
heard somebody say
that
3
form
more.
You did?
already.
Okay.
The mayor, somebody else had not signed.
Oh,
Stop talking about
slackers. Slackers.
Yeah,
That's what you ramp it on up.
That'll be the next.
I wouldn't say that. I think y'all been working around the clock on this
Mess me
speech
all
erosion thing. And we got one more King Tide still coming?
Oh, yeah.
Tonight, yeah, tomorrow.
Well, then what, another cycle,
And another
3
one.
weeks?
Yeah.
All right, it is 3 p.m. on Tuesday, October 3rd, special city council meeting. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that the press and public were duly notified of the meeting in accordance with the Freedom of Information Act. Our city clerk's not with us tonight, but we have everybody present. Kevin Popson's on the phone with us, so we obviously have a quorum. Purpose of our meeting is discussion of beach erosion along the south end of the beach near Breach Inlet and consideration of alternatives for temporary erosion mitigation and with presentation from Stephen Trainum from Coastal Science and Engineering. Stephen and crew, thank you guys for being here with us and over the weekend and for the last few months. And council, thank you for being flexible today and showing up for a special meeting. I appreciate that. So today, I think, end of the day, we've got short-term solutions, medium-term to talk about, which is the Army Corps project, and potentially some long-term solutions if we want to give directions to staff on doing some additional research on a couple of pieces. But, so I think if we can kind of stay focused mostly on the short-term to give immediate relief for some of our residents and options for our city to take some action. So Desiree, if you don't mind, why don't we level set just a little bit, just to make sure we're all on the same page as we kind of get educated here today. And Stephen, again, thank you all for coming. And Desiree and Douglas really would be remiss. I know you guys have been, maybe not 24/7, but maybe 22/7 on this topic. And thank you for your efforts. And
Yes.
over the weekend, Douglas, I know you both were on site, so thank you guys for your efforts. And Desiree, I want you to level set us a little bit.
Yeah, of course. I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about where we are now, what we've done. Then I'll introduce Stephen, who will talk about some of the alternatives that we would like for council to consider for us to flush out. And then another topic we want to touch on is related to the city's ordinances and the restrictions that we currently have on the books on erosion control measures and some options for the city to consider. And Douglas will touch on that and talk a little bit about where our jurisdiction starts, where the state's jurisdiction starts, and talk a little bit about those nuances. So that's how we sort of organize the conversation from us for this meeting. As you all know, the area between Breach Inlet and roughly the fourth beach access path has been severely impacted by erosion during the past several months. In the summer, we worked and articulated a potential trucking project to bring in beach-compatible sand from an upland source to restore the berm and the dune that had been impacted by high tides back in May. When we were getting ready to execute that project, Storm Idalia comes in. The state gives us an emergency order to allow for sand scraping along that area, which is a much quicker, more efficient process than trucking in sand. So we pivoted, had the contractor mobilize, and the day after Idalia, we were already out there and had a plan in place to scrape sand in accordance with the state's permit along the area between 100 and 314 Ocean Boulevard. That project was completed. We had a continuous set of high tides that continued to exacerbate the erosion down that area. We asked the contractor to remobilize about 2 weeks ago to continue the sand scraping along 3 properties that even after the city's emergency berm restoration project had lost most of that dune and were within the state's emergency threshold, which is a property or a habitable structure, including a pool, is within 20 feet of the erosion. So we had the contractor out here, mobilized, and started working along those three properties. The high tides that we experienced last week exposed additional properties to more erosion. And at that point, we asked the contractor to bring in additional equipment, and we submitted and requested a permission from the state for us to go back and do additional sand scraping along the same stretch of area between 100 and 314 Ocean. We believe that what we're doing has not been very efficient or effective. As we have seen, a lot of the sand that has been scraped is gone. Most, I would say 98% of the berm that we placed a couple of weeks ago is now gone. And we felt like it would be appropriate for us to have a conversation about what we do above and beyond what we're currently doing, which is what we're permitted to do, and be in a better position to protect this area ahead of the king tides that are predicted to happen mid to late October. We are also looking for solutions, medium-term, the mayor referenced medium-term solutions for us to get us through the next few months until the execution of the Army Corps project. And just as a reminder for you all and a reminder for those that are here or watching, the city is partnering with the United States Army Corps of Engineers on a beneficial use project that anticipates placing approximately 500,000 cubic yards of sand from spoil sites that we have, that the Army Corps of Engineers has on the Intercoastal, moving all that which is beach compatible to the section of beach between 2nd and 9th. We would then, at that point, execute our own project to mobilize some of that sand away from the surf where it's going to be placed and not only restore the dune, but also enhance the dry sand beach along that area. That project is expected to be executed in January of 2024, so we're looking at 4 to 5 months from now. Good news is if there is a government shutdown, that project has already been appropriated, and we should not expect any delays due to that. So that's kind of where we are. That's what we have been doing under my ability to approve a project under an emergency situation. I do think that we are in a moment where we need to act. Not doing something will put a lot of these properties at greater harm. And, in an effort to be proactive, we want to talk to you all about a couple of options, whether it's changing the scope of the work that we're currently doing. We'll talk about some ordinances that I think some of you are interested in evaluating, and get some direction from you all about what we do next. So with that, Mayor, I think.
If you could put into context, you said Corps of Engineers is doing 500,000 cubic yards. Can you put that in context based upon how many cubic yards were done at Wild Dunes 2 or 3 years ago?
The project in Wild Dunes, we mobilized about 1.2 million cubic yards of sand.
So roughly half what was done at Wild Dunes, which if you were down there was a massive undertaking.
It would be a significant project down Breach Inlet.
And Desiree, for more context, what did we do 3 weeks ago as far as building the berm? How many cubic yards was that?
I think
Remember?
about 5,000, 10,000
10,000
cubic yards.
to build that berm. And now,
Correct.
one of the things we'll talk about tonight may be a 50,000 cubic yard add, so.
Correct.
Yeah.
Can you put a price tag on the Corps of Engineers work?
Well, if we look at in the context of what we did at Wild Dunes, that project was 1.3 million, 1.2 million, maybe a little bit more. It was $18 million, so maybe half of that.
Would be
So like 9.
$9
million.
million. I'm getting my sand mixed up with my dollars, okay. So about
Approximately 9 million, I think.
So
we
the
would-
Corps project would cost $9 million. So if we,
Well,
Not
yeah,
to
hang on.
us.
Well,
No,
that would be,
yeah, not to the city.
Correct. That is a project
yeah,
that we are not paying for any of that specific work. The Corps is doing that work. There will be
Right.
components that we would be adding to that and enhancing that project that would fall under the city's purview that we would have to pay for it, but not the $9 million
do we know
project.
what that amount would be?
Not yet.
Okay.
So we're ready to
Yep.
hear from Stephen about what options are available and flush those out? All right, Stephen, thank you.
All right, can y'all hear me? Is this on? Okay. I have Dr. Patrick Barrino here with us from our office. We were just out on site, and thanks for having me back down. Just to put into context a little bit more of what we've dealt with the past month, when we built the berm originally, when we built the berm originally, again, it was about 10,000 yards of material that was placed along that stretch. The trucking project we originally proposed was about 6,500 yards. When the hurricane hit, we expanded the area because more area was impacted. That project held up fairly well for the first couple of weeks it was in place. There was one little section that was kind of getting impacted a little bit, but overall it was holding up okay. But we knew there was really no guarantee with that type project. A scraping project is generally very beneficial after a storm because a storm shifts sands from the dune to the lower beach profile, and you're basically just pushing it back up. The situation that we dealt with is we were already kind of having an erosional event before the storm. We did the scraping, and it did hold up well, but that whole area is not in a great position as far as it's not stable right now. It's just in an erosional cycle that's associated with changes going on in Breach Inlet. That's part of that inlet cycle of shoal bypassing and channel migration. Once we started to run into very high tides, it started about September 25th, September 26th. 9 of the last 12 high tides we've had have been over 7.5 feet, measured in Charleston Harbor. So you have to throw waves on top of that. So we've pretty much been in a sustained king tide event for well over a week now. And we're likely to continue having some high tides at least through Friday because we have more northeast winds. And we've just been northeast winds every day since then. That's what's kept our water elevations up to 1.5 feet higher than the predicted tide that we were expecting. So once those tides hit and kept hitting, it's just twice a day, every day, that dune was being impacted directly by those tides and waves. So it completely eliminated most of the dune except as you get all the way into the Breach Inlet part of the shoreline where it starts to curve back, that dune's actually still there today and hasn't really been impacted at all, which is a good sign. But they've been out there now. They've mobilized equipment that can move sand more efficiently, but it's still, most of what they're putting every day is eroded in the next tide cycle. We've had to operate under what the state has allowed us to do, and that's why we've kind of been ramping up the efforts over the past week, going from a single bulldozer affecting 2 or 3 properties, then they brought in a second bulldozer, and now we've brought back in the truck and the excavator. Because as more properties became eligible for that emergency condition, the state has granted us the authority to do more effort. So we've kind of had to work within that scenario. I'm optimistic that over the next week, with the equipment that's out there now, that we'll be able to at least get ahead of it a little bit and start, building a dune that will withstand a tide or 2 tides. And with the weather forecast starting this weekend, we'll have offshore winds and the tides will be lower. I'm feeling, if we can get through this week, that we'll be in a better situation until we have the next weather event or next king tide event. So I know you've been, go ahead. Mr.
Well, and Stephen, the next king tide's like the 24th, 25th, somewhere in there of October, and that's the last one for the year, right? The calendar year, at least what's on the books.
Yeah, I mean, every month has a set of spring tides.
Higher, yeah.
The spring tides and neap tides, and the king tide term is just kind of the higher than normal spring tides. So you always have that. But honestly, a king tide with good weather isn't that big of a deal. A moderate tide with onshore winds and waves is a much heavier impact than just a calm tide level. So that's what's really been affecting us the past 3 or 4 days is we're out of that king tide cycle almost, but the water's still set up over 1 foot higher than the predicted tide. So that's where it's unpredictable. You can't just look at the tide chart. You have to factor in if we have a northeast storm event, we're going to have impacts again. So I know you've been presented with a couple of different options. There's a couple of, state required, or the state only allows us a couple of things that we can do. That's truck in sand, scrape sand, or put in sandbags. The scraping is what we're trying to accomplish now. It's the quickest way to move sand. That's the biggest benefit, is it's relatively cheap, relatively quick. The biggest concern over that, though, is you're not adding sand to the system. You're just shifting it around. What we're trying to accomplish is taking sand from the widest parts of the beach around the inlet and moving that within the bounds. So we're trying to recycle sand within the system, but you're not increasing the overall quantity. That's what the trucks and excavators are allowing us to do. That's a little different than the bulldozers just pushing it from the bottom to the top. So it's a little bit better way to do it, and it's much more like bringing it in from offshore than the dozer work that we were doing last week. Trucking in sand is something you've already looked at before. We had that approved. It's a relatively expensive way to get sand. It's really the most expensive way you can get sand on a beach. And it's a relatively slow process because a truck only holds 15 yards. So if you have 100 trucks per day, that's 1,500 yards of material that's coming to the beach. So even if you intend to add 25 or 50,000 yards of material, it takes several weeks of small increments to build up that quantity. And with the erosion cycle that we're having now, I can't tell you that if you put 1,500 yards out one day, that much of that's going to be there the next day to build on top of or add to. It can build a beach over time, but with the weather situation that we just had, I wouldn't be optimistic that that's going to provide a wide, dry sand beach like a big nourishment project would. It certainly has the benefit of adding sand to the system, but with any just sand project right now, there is risk that material may not be there, several weeks from when it was placed. So that's a question.
No, I was going to say, so Steve, I think what I'm hearing you say is even if we started tomorrow, we can only truck in 30,000, and if you're looking at a 50,000 cubic yard project, we got to supplement from somewhere else.
Say that one more time, sir.
So we got 20 days to the next tide cycle.
Okay.
So you're saying, 20 times 15, we can only get in probably 30,000. If we trucked all the sand we wanted to, we could only get 30,000 cubic yards, which isn't going to accomplish what you think we need for volume to suspend the
Right.
reduction.
There's a limitation there, and there's the option to try to combine the scraping effort that we're doing, which that you can move maybe 3,000 to 4,000 yards in a day, working pretty hard, with trucking in additional sand from offshore and kind of supplementing those two projects. So you're bringing in additional sand really from both areas, but try to get the maximum quantity.
Stephen,
Yes.
I guess we're all talking about trying to make, this is a short-term solution and our medium-term solution. It's trying to bridge us to the Corps of Engineer project.
Correct.
How much sand do you feel, new sand, needs to be brought on to that section of beach from Breach to Fourth or wherever it is that can get us to that time period in January or whenever the Corps project starts?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to predict, but what I can tell you is I went back and looked at the volume change that we saw from 21 to 22. We don't have the numbers for 23 yet, but I can get those this week. And that area of the beach lost 75,000 yards from 21 to 22. And I feel like the past year's erosion is probably higher than that. So 50,000 yards, in an ideal scenario, might buy 6 months worth of erosion, but placing it in the current condition is not, you're likely to see that spread out faster than you would as if it was because essentially you're building a bulge out into a shoreline that doesn't want it to be there. So it's going to rapidly spread at first. So to give you kind of a guarantee, which I'm not going to do, but I would say on that order of 50,000 to more, could provide, months worth of protection, but there is no guarantee with it. Because especially, again, as you're trucking it in, that material is not just going straight into the top part of the beach and staying there. Every tide, that material is being shifted lower into the profile. And if you were out there earlier today, you saw how quickly water is moving to the south with these northeast winds. So as it's shifting lower in the profile, it's immediately wanting to go outside of the project area. So it's, more sand is certainly a great option and the answer to the problem, but I can't tell you that 50,000 yards is going to get you there 2 months from now and still be there.
And Stephen, oh, Katie, go ahead.
Would it be helpful to put more, to go higher? I mean, I know at 42nd, we've got tons of the sand from Wild, I mean, we've pretty much got all of Wild Dune sand now.
We're going to try
So-
to get a permit to move that back up to.
Yeah. But I mean, so like, I understand we're focusing on, you know, the areas where it's bad, but is it beneficial to go farther than that so that it accretes back down or?
In
whatever the
long-term
word is?
strategies, yes, and that's what the core project is largely going to do, is most of the material is going to be placed north of Third Avenue, really between Third and Ninth. So it's putting all the, the money in the bank, where over time it'll trickle out down south. The project that we're contemplating, kind of supplementing it, would be shifting some of that material to the areas that need it. And I can't tell you, we'll base that off of what the conditions look like at the time. But I don't think we're going to get much benefit by putting sand like in a dune further north. It's not likely in its current configuration to move south and then accumulate back in the dune, unless it's a very substantial project, on the order of 100,000 yards or so.
And Stephen, I know you're in constant contact with Army Corps as well. I mean, how confident is this January date from a start standpoint for that project, do you think, today?
They sound very confident in that. They sent us the final plans that they need a response back by on the 6th, so they are rapidly approaching putting it out for bid. I'm not sure if their contract includes a stop date on when that may.
Has their history been one that they typically deliver these projects on
Yeah,
time?
for this type of project, yes.
Okay.
This is very different from like the 50-year storm damage studies that sometimes take 2 decades to get through and never get funded. They've already got funds. They've already, moved through all the studies and environmental reviews and everything.
Well,
So
and they have a need, so, yeah.
And
Is
we
there any
have-
chance to move it up?
I think they're moving as fast as they can now. I don't think that there's much opportunity to go through the bid process. Is at least 30-day period. And
Desiree, would
Just to piggyback on the timing question, we have, as you all know, this project it also involves placing about 200,000 cubic yards of sand at Sullivan's Island. We have requested a couple times for the Corps to consider us starting with the IOPs first, due to the condition and the erosion that we're seeing in that area, and we're hopeful that they'll be able to grant that.
the final option is sandbags. That's something that has proven to be a blessing and a curse. If done well, sandbags can do a very good job of protecting upland properties. We've seen that at the East End. We've seen it in other communities. If done poorly, they turn into a mess and can cause problems for neighbors. So any recommendation that I would have for sandbags kind of comes with a caveat that it needs to be done well, because you need a continuous line of protection. If you have a gap in it, then owners adjacent to that gap are subject to flanking erosion. Sometimes they'll have to build kind of wing walls to go back, and you end up with a staggered shoreline that doesn't look as good, doesn't perform as well. They do a very good job of holding the line in place, but they do require maintenance. The state requires that a bond be put in place to ensure their removal. I don't think our company has ever recommended, sandbags before, but in a situation like this, where we know that there is a long-term solution, I'll call that the core project, coming very soon, that there's kind of a clear end date. To me, that's a good option to try to hold the line, knowing that if we did just supplement sand, that with the next king tide or nor'easter event, we may not have any protection and be right back in the situation we're in again today. So again, it's not a recommendation that I would take lightly, but it's in this particular situation, if owners or the city, that's for y'all to decide, but elected to do sandbags, that's certainly a viable option in this place. And you could supplement that with some dune restoration and scraping. You wouldn't want to try to put the sandbags as far seaward as possible. Everything with this project, you want to keep as landward as possible to try to help yourself until this core project is put in place. Once that project's in place, I think you have flexibility to try to restore things. Yes, sir.
Well, these are the
really large industrial sandbags. It's not like the ones that we have to
It's not the
protect
little
our.
it's not the little 5 gallon
Right.
bags. There are two options now. The state allows 1 cubic yard is the volume, and that typically was the super sacks, the 3x3x3 that were all over the Wild Dunes. The small ones are the ones that created all the controversy because they wash immediately everywhere. You find them all over the state. The large ones perform much better. And then recently at Debadoo Beach, a new type of bag was installed that performed really well, and it was more of a fibrous textile material. They're longer and flatter, but they're still 1 cubic yard, so they stack a little better, and you can actually move them after they've been put in place. They're a good bit more expensive, but they do last a lot longer. They have UV protection and seem to hold up a lot better. So those are the ones that I would recommend. They're about 4 times the cost of the super sack, just for the material, but seem to give you a better product.
Thanks. How many properties currently would be eligible for the sandbag option?
I would say around 6 or 7.
Yeah, we think
We
it's
had
7.
3 that were
7.
threatened at one time, now it's up to 6,
7.
7.
Yeah, we think 2 already have permission and 5 additional probably are either being granted permission or very close to being
Okay.
granted
To
permission.
place sandbags.
Correct.
And I think OCRM, sorry to interrupt, would be flexible if there was a property between 2 that was not technically meeting it. If they understood that the erosion pressure is likely to meet it very soon, it's in their interest and everybody's interest to make a continuous line. So they have been flexible before, especially if it's done kind of as a coordinated effort, because they understand that it helps them out a lot more to have it, make sense.
How long has the geotextile bags been in place at Debadoo, and how are they holding up?
They've been in place several years. That one, I don't want to go into too many long details on it, but they were put in place before their last nourishment project, which was completed in 2022. They were there for a couple of years before that, and then those owners are trying to get permission to leave them in place and bury them and have a core dune system. So they're working with some researchers out of Coastal Carolina to do a study which the state could allow. It's been a little controversial. NGOs and Coastal Conservation League folks don't like that idea, so they're working through that. I'm not recommending that the city consider some type of buried long-term bag placement, but if any homeowner, you need to have the clear end date that as soon as this beach is rebuilt, these bags would come out.
And then my last question is, can we consider all 3 alternatives, basically, doing some of each during this temporary project to get us through to the U.S. Corps of Engineers project?
I think you can. Once bags are in place, OCRM will not let you scrape sand in front of those anymore. So you could do some effort where you're trying to restore some type of minimal dune or some type, kind of fix the shoreline at least back to a relatively straight shoreline and then put bags in front of that. I think if you go too far out, OCRM would say, hey, you're too far out. Again, trying to keep it as far landward as possible, but essentially trying to fix the areas that are really scarped back and put in a logical thing. And
Okay, thanks.
Jan and Scott.
First of all, the 7 homeowners that are affected now, are they contiguous? Is it a full straight line?
Pretty close to it. Yeah, not exactly. There's kind of a spot here and there in the 7, but they're all kind of in the same general area.
So it's likely we could have install a
close.
continuous line
I
of
think so.
sandbags. Do the sandbags, are they placed on private property?
ideally, they would be placed right at the toe of the escarpment, which would be on the very high wet sand beach. Is that private property or not? I think that's within the state trust area at that point, but I'll look it back on that.
I mean, with the beach erosion, is that
So
considered
so
private
we will
property?
get into in our next talk about the jurisdictional lines. I think in every situation, it's landward of mean high tide, so it would be private property, but it could be that public trust property that the public has the rights to use the property.
Okay,
But in OCRM's jurisdiction, but private property.
okay, so my next question is, we couldn't get easements for the work that we've been doing on several of the properties. So, next question, I guess we can wait until next time then about whether we're going to need easements to do this work in the future.
I believe that the easement document included, it was general to erosion control measures by the city. I would think that placing sandbags would fall into that definition.
So we took care of that hurdle with the last project, is what you're saying?
I
You
believe
think?
the language of the existing easement that we have would allow the city to place sandbags.
Okay,
And
thank
we
you.
only didn't get one. There's only one in there that we just didn't get an easement. on.
One property owner
One
between
property.
100 and 314 did not grant an easement. We have easements from everybody else.
Okay,
So what do we do with that property?
They're not an issue yet. They're kind of up towards the, they're not really adjacent to or that near to the 7 that are having the problem. Could get there, but currently they're not in that stretch.
okay.
Scott?
I'm just trying to listen to what you're saying and try to get to maybe what you're recommending or what I think I'm hearing. And that would be to put as much sand in front of a home as possible, especially the qualifying homes, build a contiguous line then with the bags, whether it's the 10 properties or whatever in a line to sort of fortify that, and then use a combination of scraping or sand trucking in to maybe get to the 50,000 number that you think is going to prepare us for the October cycle and maybe get us to the January cycle. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
I don't think you would need to do the 50,000. Once you place the bags, that's your line of defense. And I think that's, I would say that's either or. Once you place the bags, you wouldn't be allowed to place additional sand in front of
Got
that.
it. Yeah, I understood that.
And I don't think you would place 50,000 and then try to place bags seaward of that. I mean, you certainly could, try to move as much material as possible before and just see how it performs. I mean, some of this will likely require, just kind of daily observation to see how the beach is responding.
That kind of went to my next question about whatever volume you determine is the volume. You said that we lost 75,000 in prior year, but that was probably stable dune, I'm guessing. And now we're putting in unstable sand that might wash out a little bit quicker. I'm thinking from an authorization standpoint for the council, do we need to approve you a certain volume to achieve at that end date to fortify, or I don't know how that would work. I guess we can work through that. But you need the target to make its fortification before that next cycle of tide. Is that correct?
I mean, my recommendation as far as just adding sand would be let's try to remove as much off the spit as we can,
Yep.
because that's the most efficient way to do it. If we felt like we needed more and the first sign that any properties may be affected, or not even any properties, but the high tide beach may be affected, we would stop doing that. And then that's probably best done by a dollar amount rather than a volume, because it's going to be very difficult to track the volumes in those situations with the beach constantly eroding. On the sandbag issue, there is the likelihood that if we just continue to place sand, some owners are probably on their own going to put sandbags in if they feel like this dune is not holding up, regardless of any effort we make. So if that's the case, and again, I'm supportive of those owners individually, at what point does it make sense to make it a full continuous, logical effort instead of a spot by spot with gaps in between?
I think the gaps in between add to the problem, because you're stopping at what you even alluded to. It's if you have one home that has some even on the scraping, where you're scraping up to the 6 or 7 that are under this emergency act, the ones around it, are getting even more erosion because it's pushing at a higher velocity through there. And when we're talking about these emergency pieces, if I'm correct, they qualify under it because they're within 20 feet of a structure. And I don't know about you, but the waves coming through there are extremely violent. And if it's in 20 feet of my home, I mean, I'm looking at how do I get my stuff out of my home before the ocean falls in the water. I mean, that's close. I mean, too close for comfort for me. And there's a lot of homeowners that are asking, why can't I put my own barriers up? And it's because we have a city ordinance that I hope we get to that prevents them from doing that, because it's within 250 feet of the high water mark is not allowed. Well, all of these homes, 250 feet of the high water mark takes it to Ocean Boulevard, almost all of them, so they're restricted from doing that. And I personally think we need to open it up and allow homeowners to put sandbags, and remove the city restriction to allow them to put sandbags up to the setback line. In addition to that, I think we ought to do everything, as some have alluded to, combinations of all of these to allow us to put 50,000 cubic yards of sand back in there to give us a fighting chance to last till to January. I mean, I just think we need to pull out all stops. It's a horrible catastrophic condition down there.
Okay, I have a one
Is
more.
it not feasible to do both bringing in sand and sandbags, like timing wise?
It
that-
is. It's feasible. The sandbag operation's not going to be a one-day deal. It'll take several days or maybe a week or more to
Yeah.
get all those in. Just to put some rough dollar amounts on it, 50,000 yards of trucked-in sand is probably about a $2 million effort. 25,000 would be about a $1 million effort for trucked-in sand.
But you can get dry sand, you can get dry sand in a combination of hauling from the spit down as well as new fresh sand hauled in, right?
Right. And yes, I think we can get as much, I can't tell you exactly what volume I think we
Right.
can get off of that. I think it's at least 20,000 yards, if I had to guess, that's off the spit. Hopefully more than that.
So if you got 20, then you'd have to haul in 30. I mean, if you got 30 off the spit, you'd have to haul in 20.
Right.
And I think that's why it may make sense just to give, I mean, for us to give you all the freedom to bring in 50,000 cubic yards, whatever way you can get fresh sand in there to build that berm and the beach out, up to a certain dollar limit, we can cap it, but to allow you the freedom to do whatever makes the most sense economically and and technology-wise to get that fresh sand in there. As you say, it's kind of you kind of put it in, you have to see what happens, and it's a day-by-day kind of decision-making, and we don't want to tie your hands in any way.
Jan, and then let's keep moving. Douglas, to your piece.
My question was basically about timing, how long it would take to install the sandbags, and in the interim, while we're installing the sandbags, that we probably need to keep the beach scraping going? Is that the way it
I
works?
think the plan is to keep the beach scraping going at least through this week, as we're still dealing with the wind event. I think we probably need 4 to 5 days of lead time to start the sandbag project. I'm assuming they can probably install at least 50 a day, if not 100 a day, which we're estimating each lot would need about 100. So a week to
7
two
days.
to fully do the sandbag operation, if that was the decision.
And the estimated cost of the sandbag operation per property is between $30,000 and $40,000 per property.
It's depending
For
on type of bag,
sandbags.
depending on which bag
And
is
the
available.
length of the property.
Property line.
Stephen, wasn't there a shortage of the good bags that would take some
There-
lead time to?
There's 140 available right now, and they said it may take them a couple of days. They have all the fabric they need to manufacture the other ones. They just need to sew them, so it would take a couple of days to start that.
And does that cost include installation, monitoring, and removal?
That's installation, which would be bringing beach-compatible material to Breach Inlet, the access, filling the bags at that access, and putting them in. When it's time to remove them, you're probably looking at if I had to guess, $25,000 to $30,000 or $40,000 cost to remove all those bags.
All the bags?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it'd be
And
much,
what
much
about,
cheaper.
what about the monitoring and maintenance during the course of the months? Because
Monitoring
that-
could really be done by, city staff just on a every other day type basis, or just to take photos or document that they haven't spread out too much. Maintenance, if they start shifting around, it's taking a mini excavator and just picking them up and replacing them. It's a, fairly minimal in cost, but it's something that at least needs to be checked in on, on an occasional basis.
The newer bags, I know the biggest benefit was that they last longer, but we
They're-
don't really need them for that long, so.
They
do
are
I-
more stable. The super sacks, again, it's a big cube, and they can fall over and shift around. again, it's not something that can't be overcome, especially for a pretty limited period.
But
And-
since we're only talking about a short period of time,
Yeah.
the UV of the nicer ones doesn't really matter. I mean, the regular ones seem to last, I mean, they last.
Yeah, the Super Sacks, each bag is around $30 per bag. The other ones are about $130 per bag. That doesn't include the filling and the placement, so you'd save about $100 per bag. So 10,000 per lot, I guess, on the thing. And I'm not opposed to that, especially in this type of situation. But they probably would require a little bit more maintenance, just because of the way they settle. It's a little harder to stack them.
But the idea would be that these would be temporary, would be removed ahead of a larger project, like the one we're conceptualizing with the core. So it would be a temporary effort.
Yeah.
One of the largest issues with sandbags is when they're done by individual owners, when the project's in place, those individual owners a lot of times don't want to remove them. And then that draws out and gets a lot of controversy.
Do we want to talk about the second piece on the city ordinance and
Yeah,
the
to John's
current
point.
restriction on erosion control measures, landward of the OCRM critical line? So Douglas will show you, we'll walk through what all these
Thank you,
lines
Stephen.
mean, and at least give you all foundational information to have that conversation.
Yeah, so what's on the screen now is the OCRM jurisdictional lines. And OCRM picks up jurisdiction by two ways. Either it's the land that's seaward of that, the red line is the baseline and the blue line is the setback line. And if the property you're talking about is seaward of that blue line, it's in OCRM's jurisdiction. There is a separate way that they also pick up jurisdiction, and that's by the beach becoming what they call an active beach. This, where my cursor is, may or may not be a section of active beach. But if you get to a point where the tide is coming up landward of their lines, they claim jurisdiction in that area as well. So that's a little bit more dynamic. So you have that stagnant, permanent line that gets reestablished about every 10 years. And then you have this active beach line, which comes and goes a little bit as the beach erodes and accretes. So the kind of regulatory framework that we work in here is if you are on the ocean side of their jurisdiction, OCRM will not allow any hard erosion control devices except when the erosion gets to within 20 feet of your home or your pool, they will allow you to do these 1 cubic yard bags. And that's, as we've been talking about, we have 2 so far that have met that criteria, and we have a handful more that probably will here in the near future. So that is the state's jurisdiction. Then you have this kind of overlapping jurisdiction that the city has enacted by local ordinance, whereby we measure 250 feet landward of the mean high tide line. So just to kind of visually represent that, my cursor is probably about at mean high tide where it goes to that dark line. We would measure 250 feet this way, and as John mentioned earlier, generally that gets you in this area right out to about the road. That's in the city's jurisdiction, and in our jurisdiction we say, okay, if you're in the state's jurisdiction, go talk to them. So you'll see some of that area is still seaward of the blue line. We say that's state's jurisdiction, you have to talk to them. But if you're within 250 feet and outside of the state's jurisdiction, the city's ordinance says you also cannot do any hard erosion control devices. And currently it exempts 5-gallon bags. So if you were to do a 5-gallon bag, that is considered not a hard erosion control device, and you could do that. We have been noodling and hearing kind of calls for that to be reconsidered and to be looked at. We've talked about a handful of different ways of doing that, but I think that what we've landed on as being a potential thing to consider would be to allow those same bags that OCRM permits, so those are the 1 cubic yard bags that Stephen was referencing, allowing those anywhere in our jurisdiction, so from the state's jurisdiction to a point 250 feet inland, and just allow those to be done by the resident, at their expense, at their, so it would really be a switch from the definition of what is a hard erosion control device from a 5-gallon bag to a 1 cubic yard bag. And we would allow owners to do that. So that's kind of what we're thinking the change would look like. We've talked about how we would do that. That is in the zoning code, and a change to the zoning code is 2 readings, a public hearing, a trip to the planning commission. So it takes a little bit of time. We thought about, and we've been talking with Mac about if it's a change that the city council wanted to consider, could we do it by an emergency ordinance and have that ready for you at your workshop date, so we could potentially have a meeting prior to that meeting to consider an emergency ordinance if you all saw fit. We're also, we've been talking to you all received a letter from the Coastal Conservation League, and any kind of adjustment to a hard erosion control provision seems to kind of bring people out in opposition to that. And we're trying to meet with people, talk to people about, is this threading the needle between allowing protection, but also the protection being soft enough and not being a bulkhead or a groin or something permanent where they could have some buy-in to it. So we're still kind of talking to people about that. Hope to have a better feel for that by next week. So that's kind of what we're thinking and where we're headed.
Blair?
Douglas, to understand what you're saying, if the tide is coming up to wherever the area is, that's OCRM jurisdiction.
That's correct.
So if it's wet sand in any way, shape, or form, it doesn't matter what we do,
That's correct.
correct? So
Well,
I don't
so
really.
you would have to preemptively, so I think I understand where you're going. It's kind of where we've been talking. An owner would have to preemptively set these bags before the jurisdiction became the state's.
Okay,
They'd have
so-
to be anticipating it, place those bags, and then they would be there prior to the state taking jurisdiction of them.
So as an example, let's say that the council bar is the escarpment.
Yep,
That's ocean, this is dry.
yep,
You would have to place the sandbags back here
that's correct.
on top of the dry sand. So I don't see how it would actually work, because then if the escarpment moves this way, those sandbags on top are going to fall down.
Well, you'd either have to excavate them.
So you'd have to dig a trench, put sandbags in the trench.
That's correct. That's how we think that would be done.
Thank you.
And Douglas, in this example here, and I guess to Blair's point, you're not necessarily talking about sandbags inside the blue line.
That's correct.
You
So
could be even further back in,
yeah,
right?
so theoretically, and again, I'll use my cursor here, and this one may be, we would first, if we were to use this property as the example, first thing to do would be to have the state tell us where their jurisdiction begins and ends. We would then instruct this owner that they could place bags. Let's just say hypothetically, the state said, okay, this is active beach, this is our jurisdiction. We would then authorize them to put sandbags in this area. Whereby if you don't change the code, that owner is gonna have to wait until that erosion line gets right up to within 20 feet of their pool before they can do something.
So it would allow people to be proactive and avoid getting to the 20-foot threshold where emergency sandbags would be authorized.
And Douglas, and I guess John, maybe behind your question too, around if we wanted to tweak the current city ordinance, is that for a certain time period? I know we have some more research to do for maybe a longer term conversation.
We've
but-
been talking about an emergency ordinance that would be effective for 60 days and could be extended for another, we could be
Several.
extended if we chose to. We've also talked about following the OCRM model that they use, whereby they'd have to be removed upon the project coming to fruition. We'd make them remove.
Why
the
wouldn't we
bag.
do it until January, though, when the project's going to be, instead of 60 days, you'd want to do it till January?
Well, so we think we would allow the placement as long as that emergency order continuously got renewed by council.
Yeah.
Probably until January, until the project came to fruition. And then once the project was happening, we would force them to be removed.
Can you help me understand why we wouldn't? We're just going to have to come back and renew until the project, otherwise, I'm just trying to understand too. I'm kind of where John is.
Why it would
wouldn't
be
we just?
emergency versus?
No, why
60
wouldn't we,
days.
why wouldn't we link the time frame to coincide with whenever the project comes? Why do we want to create more layers of approval?
That's what the
State
emergency ordinance
statute.
statute says. It
Oh, you have to have a
basically
60
says
day?
Emergency ordinances shall expire automatically as of the 61st day following the date of enactment.
Well, then that's a very good reason.
Well,
Following the rules.
The city could enact an emergency ordinance quick. That would be, we would not have to go through this 2 readings and a public hearing. So it's the quickest path to have something enacted and have people be able to deploy sandbags within their property. In the meantime, if that is a change that the city is comfortable with keeping forever, we can go through the process and amend it permanently, not through an emergency ordinance.
It would just take time
It would
because
just-
the
yeah.
zoning has to have public hearings. But to that point, and to Stephen's point earlier, currently the ordinance allows the 5-gallon bags, and those were what was so problematic. So, I mean, there's some wisdom, I think, in just revisiting that altogether, because
Yeah. So
when
we
they
don't end up
became
having to do
effective.
this again.
Yeah, so
Correct.
we,
Yeah, Jan and Blair.
Okay. My question is for you, Steve, and that is, if we permit the residents to do their own work, is that going to be, will there be conflicts with what we're planning on doing? For instance, you've already said there's a shortage of the cubic yard bags, and what about where the sand would come from that they're using to fill those bags?
I don't know that there would be too much of a conflict, other than the bag material may create some type of delay. If somebody pulls the trigger first and makes the order, they would get those first. But that particular manufacturer has plenty of material to make as many as the town would need. And if individual owners are doing their own thing, it would be up to them to find a contractor and figure out the logistics of actually getting those bags put in place. So as long as they weren't interfering with the city's work, I think we'd want to work with them. But the biggest issue I could see is if somebody put in their own bag placement, and then if the city doesn't do anything as a large scale, or those residents kind of don't group together and do something, if one person puts it as far out as they possibly can and then the next person doesn't, that's going to create another situation where the owner with the bags is going to try to build an island where they're going to have now bags coming shore parallel or perpendicular and creating a rectangle out with the water around it, which can exacerbate erosion to the adjacent properties.
Yeah.
Blair.
Stephen, I'm still trying to understand all the logistics here. So if this is the escarpment line, and this is our jurisdiction on this side of it, I can't imagine that anybody would support digging a trench within a foot of it or 2 feet of it, because it's just gonna fall in. So how far back from that line would you recommend that we allow somebody, if we were going to do so, to allow them to trench and put sandbags in?
Yeah, it's a little different situation than we've had to deal with. This is not something that we've seen before where people are kind of proactively putting in bags. Our recommendation with any emergency measure is it's done as far landward as possible. That gives it the best chance of protecting. So if a homeowner is putting in bags, I would tell that homeowner, put it 20 to 30 feet from your house at the most, and try to hope that the beach is doing its job and protecting that it never gets impacted. If somebody's trying to put them in so much further seaward, again, you're completely right that if it's 5 feet from the escarpment, it doesn't make any sense. You just put them at the escarpment and go from there.
But that, as council, we're gonna have to make this decision. So if the decision of council is we're gonna allow people to put it in bags, we need to have a distance from the escarpment back before those bags can be put in place. So we just need to know.
I don't think
what
that's
that
the
number
case,
is.
though,
Do it
is
the other way.
Sure it is.
It's not council's decision at
Do it
that
from
point.
the
It becomes
structure.
the decision of OCRM. It's OCRM's jurisdiction at that point.
OCR's jurisdiction is to here.
That's right.
All we're talking about is allowing people to put sandbags on this side of that jurisdiction.
Yep.
How far, and that's all our jurisdiction, how far back from that OCRM's jurisdiction line?
Well, it's right here.
But it doesn't
they-
make any sense. If that's the jurisdiction line, I'm not going to support digging a trench right here to put in sandbags. And that just is silly, because all you're doing is ripping out sand that could help protect everybody.
Yeah,
It's
so you're
not,
saying there
though.
kind of needs to be a buffer area between the escarpment and
course
where
there
a
does.
homeowner would, and if you're landward of that, you could do it, or if you're at the escarpment, you could.
I think
Yeah.
that's a hard argument for us to get into to decide how far back. I mean, we're not technical, and.
He is, that's why.
And that's where OCRM is going. They're gonna have to make this decision with OCRM, because they're gonna have to approve it anyway.
Well,
That's
the
the-
OCRM would only come into play if
If
the
it's-
escarpment was within 20 feet of a house. And in that case, people are going to put it on the escarpment.
Right.
So in a case where, let's say you have 200 feet of berm or dune, and there's an escarpment there, and the setback line's 20 feet landward of that escarpment, you have 180 feet where you could potentially place bags, is what you're saying. Does it make sense to
Right.
put that closer to the house
That's
side,
a,
or?
yeah, that's a situation I think that does not exist here.
Yeah, Katie, go
This-
ahead.
The city's talking about putting in, one of our options is to put in, can we just talk about this in like what you're actually looking at when you're down there? So there's a cliff.
Escarpment.
We're talking about putting the city, if we were to choose to place sandbags, we would be placing those sandbags more or less up against the cliff, is that correct?
Well, we're not placing them, the resident would choose to place
No,
them.
I'm talking about our previous discussion.
Yeah, I think we have two
The-
different
yeah.
scenarios.
The option, one option is for the city to place sandbags along those properties that already meet or are very close to meeting the state's 20 feet, 20-foot threshold. That's an option for the city to do it, to make sure that we have a continuous line. In addition to that option, for properties that may not meet the 20-foot threshold yet, but still want to place sandbags along their property line, landward of the OCRM's critical line, that's where this ordinance would come into play. And if the ordinance is relaxed and that is allowed, that would be done by the property owner at their expense.
So where would those bags be going in reference to that picture?
Amy, can you get us the picture back up?
I've got,
No,
that is.
Oh, that's what
no,
you were looking for?
That
Okay.
picture.
Gotcha.
Recognize that house.
I mean, are we talking, because
So,
to me, the
Katie,
only
that's
place that
what-
it makes sense to put sandbags is in front of that, sorry, it's a cliff.
So
in
that
front
is
of the
one
cliff.
that has the permit from OCRM, and in that situation, it will go on the seaward side of that cliff. So we would,
OCRM jurisdiction.
we would build that dune.
So that's not city,
That's correct.
that's not the individual
that's kind of an
homeowner doing it
emergent-
on their own.
That's correct.
That's us doing it.
Well,
I think we are talking about potentially the city doing this in an emergency situation
Right.
to protect houses from falling in. And then we kind of have this other layer, which is the homeowner who wants to be proactive to avoid getting to this level where the city might do it, where they want to proactively protect, protect it prior to it getting to this level. And that was the Blair's
So-
example of coming back from the escarpment, putting the trench in and putting the bags down. So we have,
I feel like it would be helpful if we were actually like down there. But so in a picture like that, if it's one where we're talking about amending the ordinance to allow individuals to put in their own sandbags, where would they be?
so in that situation, if it
No,
meets
no,
OCRM's.
not in that one.
Not this one?
In
The
the,
state, in the,
in the proactive situation.
so that would be kind of back to Blair's example of you're coming onto the high land, because you're doing it before your property is this eroded. You're coming back on the high land if you have it. You're excavating a trench at some distance back from the existing escarpment and you're placing a barrier in the ground.
Couldn't even
Yeah,
see
well-
it from here.
You want to see a,
You wouldn't even be able to see it.
I'm just, as a practical matter, I just don't understand how that would even work. So somebody's gonna dig up their yard and bury sandbags?
that's,
Yeah.
that
That's
is basically what it
Yeah.
would take.
As a
And
line
then
of
we're going
defense.
to- And then we're going to make them unbury them 6 months later?
So that would be, I mean, I guess
That is the
I mean, it's just the
challenge.
rules we're dealt with. I mean, it's-
Yeah.
No, I'm not criticizing.
trying to
I'm just saying,
understand it.
I'm just
Yeah.
trying to understand logistically
Yeah.
how that would
Yeah.
work.
Yeah,
I mean,
you
that-
have owners that want to be proactive, so this would be a response to that request of, let us be proactive, and they would either choose to do it or not choose to do that.
Scott.
Stephen,
and-
Yes.
Oops, sorry. Go ahead, Mac.
Were you saying the most effective protection, though? Because I'm using Blair's example, if you dig the trench right behind the escarpment, that's going to cave in and the bags are going to be there. But could we do, if you were saying it would be further back, like 20 feet from a structure, but that gets us right back to where OCRM is. If it gets within 20 feet, then you can put the bags up there.
Yeah, and that's why maybe using kind of a extreme scenario, again, puts it in the best perspective. If a homeowner's got 200 feet of dune and they're losing it very quickly, if they put in a sandbag wall at 100 feet, if in 3 months it reaches that wall, now they've got 100 feet of yard that they're protecting, as opposed to if they waited till OCRM, they're all the way back to 20 feet. But they know they can't do anything right now out on the 200-foot section.
So Katie, this,
So- Oh, no, that was going to be my point. The other thing I think that we've got to realize, and I think it's in Blair's example, it's not like this is a fixed escarpment. These things are moving so rapidly. We've got some homeowners here today. That escarpment today is going to be gone tomorrow, the way this thing is going. They're losing 10, 20 feet a night. So to think that somebody's going to bury a bag right up to the escarpment, and, I mean, the escarpment's moving. They're using this, I think the intention is the last line of defense.
Yeah.
So they're not using it as the first line of defense, they're using it as the last line of defense, and they just want some protection so that they don't end up, they don't want to get to that 20 feet, and they're willing to maybe bury some bags to try to mitigate that. So I don't personally, Blair might have an opinion, but I don't want to micromanage where these, we're either going to allow them to do it, or we're not going to allow them to do it. And I don't want to be out there with a measuring stick determining how far away from their house they're going to plant their bags.
You're right there, Scott. I mean, you could do it.
Exactly.
Katie, that's an example, this photo, and it's significantly worse than this now, and it's approaching the 20 feet, but that's an example of a property that at that time is about 45 feet.
From
And-
the house.
Yes, that erosion cliff that's in the forefront of that photo is about 45 feet from the house. So they are seeing the erosion, but they don't qualify for any protection because that escarpment's not within 20 feet of the house. So they are watching this erosion creep back to their property, and they're waiting until it gets to within 20 feet. They then pull the trigger with OCRM and get permission to put sandbags in. This is an example of somebody who might say, let me come right behind that escarpment, which is outside of OCRM's jurisdiction, but in the city's jurisdiction, and place a line of sandbags to preemptively stop it from going, to within 20 feet of the property.
Okay, so two just follow-up questions on that, sorry. Are we, is there any way that the city or the state or anybody else could place sandbags on the ocean side of that escarpment?
No.
No current.
No,
No,
not
the
allowed to do
state-
that, because it's
state
not
law
close
doesn't
enough to
allow
a
it.
structure.
Correct.
Okay, if we're going to amend this ordinance, are we, in doing so, are we instructing them that they must dig down 4 feet, 3 feet to bury these sandbags, or is that
Well,
just?
that's the, if you all are kind of aligned with this concept, we will need to flesh out how they get done,
Guidelines, yeah.
how they're going to get pulled out. There's a lot of kind of moving parts as to how to get that figured out. And we've talked a little bit about that, and I think that you're hitting on one of Stephen's concerns, that if they're done haphazardly and done ineffectively, you're maybe not helping the situation at all.
Let me
So-
ask you a question.
Hey, John,
of-
hang on.
okay.
Rusty's been trying to hop in.
Yeah,
Go back to you.
most of this has been discussed during all the previous discussions going on around here also, but, yeah, I'm also not in favor of us getting the measuring stick out there and trying to decide for the property owner as to how far back from the from the line it should be. I mean, you'd think that they would use their reasonable judgment, as a property owner as to how far back they would want to go within the reasonable limits. In the suspension of the ordinance, we talked a little bit about that, but how long would it take us to temporarily suspend the ordinance? We talked about, having readings and, going through the planning commission, all of that. What kind of time frame are we talking about to put this in place if we decide to go that way?
So this is clearly an emergency situation, so the ordinance, our current code of ordinances allows the mayor to issue a declaration of a state of emergency. And under that scenario, city council can pass an emergency ordinance immediately. And the ordinance would be enacted when approved without a requirement of readings or public hearings. And that ordinance would be in place for 60 days. City council can continue to pass ordinances extending that, but that is the quickest way.
Just as we did many times during COVID. when we
That's
had
right,
special-
exactly, same process.
Yeah, okay.
So it would take us, we would need to get feedback and direction from council today if you all want us to draft an emergency ordinance for you all to consider at a special meeting, which could be called on Friday or Monday or Tuesday, as quick as we can get this in place for you all to consider that. So it depends on how long it would take us with legal to draft an ordinance based on the guidance and the direction we get today.
Okay.
John?
Can you go back to the previous picture, Amy?
I've got it. Which one, of the house?
The house.
Yeah.
I mean, I know we're talking about these trenches and all this stuff, and Stephen, I guess this is to you, you know OCRM better probably than most, or maybe Douglas, you, but it seems like reasonable people, I mean, theoretically, a homeowner would only have to go knock the wall down the width of a bag and place it there. There's no trench to get back to this line. But it seems like OCRM would be reasonable enough if this is a line, they'd allow them to set sandbags up in front of it. So you're talking about a 2-foot difference and not have to go through all that to protect their property at this point.
In a situation where you have multiple properties effective and they're staggered, OCRM has in the past been flexible in saying, yes, just go ahead and span those properties that may not quite meet it. I can't guarantee you that that's the case every time, but they generally have been, trying to work with owners on that.
And that's my point is if I'm a homeowner in this situation, I'm going to OCRM and trying to get some acceptance to do that. And that's why I think it's a case-by-case basis. But I just wanted to make that point.
I also believe that we would want to have a conversation in Blair's example and on this photograph. I don't think OCRM is going to allow you to do anything that modifies that erosion escarpment. So I think we would have to get guidance from them as to how far do you think, do they want us to, make people step off of that? And I don't know. I don't know if because I know their jurisdiction ends at that escarpment, so they may not be able to say, we're going to kind of by reference require an additional 8 feet. I don't know that they can do that,
But that's
we
some
can
of the
get guidance
research.
from-
You'll need
Yeah,
to
we don't
take
have
away.
authority to do that.
Can they work out? the
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
something that we would have to be proactive with because any trench within 20 feet of the escarpment is going to damage the structure of the escarpment and the ability of the escarpment to keep the ocean back.
I also think, to John's point, that, if the letter of the law is it either has to be, if the letter of the law is that escarpment has to be within 20 feet, I don't think there's any way that we could expect OCRM to say
30 feet, 40 feet.
40 feet
yeah.
is okay. I mean, they're very much by the book and have to be that way.
Yeah, they're bound by state statute and the Beachfront Management Act.
Can I just one? Okay. I don't think we're setting a line for that. You say within no closer than so many feet from the escarpment, whatever OCRM says, up to the edge of the structure. The private citizen can decide where in their yard they want to put that barrier, as long as it's not too close to the escarpment. The argument we're having is
Yeah.
meaningless at this point.
I agree. So let's
So
stop
we want
having
to
it.
make a
Let's
motion?
let's give direction to our staff.
Yes.
I think there's mostly general agreement I'm hearing that we let's take all this in order that we've talked about. continue the scraping, continue the or start the trucking to get to a 50,000 cubic yard build, right? Relax in an emergency fashion the city ordinance to allow for sandbags outside of the 20-foot emergency arena. And that's where y'all need to, staff will go away and with Mac and decide how we craft that with some conversations. So, I mean, I think we're hearing general agreement down that path, mostly.
Do we need to vote?
Mostly, yeah, we do.
Yeah.
I was just kind of grabbing,
Yeah.
attempting to grab
Yeah.
what we were.
Can you wrap that
What we were
into a
talking
motion,
about.
Phil?
Any guidance for us on how long the sandbags remain? I mean, is it temporary once the Army Corps project's over, they need to be removed by the homeowner?
I think so.
I think so, yeah.
What about permanent change to the ordinance? We kind of talked about the 5 gallons.
I think we
60
crawl a
day.
little bit before we walk here personally. That's just my
Right.
opinion.
Do we
the
want to
60
address
day
this
periods.
maybe at the workshop? Because I don't want to go through this again if this situation crops up. Maybe we could talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, and I think if council's all right, I think we just have a quick meeting before workshop on Tuesday, give you guys a week to draft an emergency ordinance. We'll hopefully pass it Tuesday night and it's effective right then so that we're not dragging this out. Wait, Scott, what are you thinking?
No, I was thinking the dates. yeah.
Okay.
So
Just the Tuesday's our regularly scheduled
Yeah.
workshop and we can just have a 30, 45 minute beforehand. Desiree, sorry.
No, I just want to be very clear what the direction is. We're going to be drafting an emergency ordinance that would relax the current prohibition on placement of sandbags landward of OCRM's jurisdictional line.
Correct.
Some details, and sandbags to be removed after the OCRM project is completed.
The
and
core.
The core, did I say, yeah, the core project. And we'll flush out some of the details between now and next week that we have discussed in terms of placement and location. And that would be up to the owner. And is that a motion?
Yes, I believe it was.
You just made, I second.
More conversation. Kevin, are you still on? Any question from your,
No, sir, I've heard everything.
okay.
We're voting only on what Desiree said.
Say it again?
We're just voting on what Desiree said.
Right.
Correct.
Which the mayor motioned.
Yeah.
Right, because you had previously talked about 50,000 cubic feet.
Yeah, we're going back to that,
We're going-
I
we'll
think,
get back to
We're going
yes.
back to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is just a motion on drafting an emergency ordinance, as I indicated.
Got it.
Do you want a roll call?
No. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
She was
Okay, okay,
aye.
got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
So that's the emergency ordinance, all right? So Desiree, staff also needs a motion on the additional scraping / trucking, right?
Correct. And the sandbagging, we talked about the option of the city being the one placing sandbags along the so far is 7 properties that fall within the 20-foot threshold will be permitted by the state to install sandbags, and an option is for the city to include that as part of our scope of work to ensure that they all are done at the same time consistently and
some
hopefully
of-
have the best chance
Sorry.
of effectiveness.
And some of those residents are already down a path though, right?
We know of 2 that have
That have
been
been
permitted
permitted, gotcha.
and are working with the contractor on quotes and timing. We know of 2 other property owners that we have been helping through the permitting process. Those have not yet been permitted, I believe. We haven't been notified. So we know of at least 4 2 that have a permit and 2 more that are in the process. And they would be doing that unless we change course, that they would be doing that at their own expense.
So do we need to authorize a volume, a dollar amount to include the sandbagging? Is that what you're looking for?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll make a motion.
Both, Scott, before you go, there's actually both, so.
It would be
kinda two-
continuing scraping.
Yeah, two different decisions to be made. Continue the scraping, trucking, or to get to a number where you're headed. And then council will need to make a decision on, for those within the 20-foot critical line, do we want to pay for that? So, sorry, Scott, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I make a motion, why don't we take the little one first? We'll make a motion to include the scoping of the sandbagging in the project that the city's going to implement.
The sandbagging.
The sandbag.
Is
Anybody
there a
second?
motion? If so, that's second.
Just to be clear, that's just for the 5 to 7 properties? or
Anybody
whatever.
within the
Correct.
20-foot?
Yeah.
Within the 20-foot, yeah.
And as that 5 to 7 changes, it would obviously, could,
Encompass new ones.
yeah, could.
I think it's
encompass-
anybody within that hits the
Yeah.
20-foot threshold, right? Scott, is that,
Yes,
that's your motion?
that is the
Are you
motion.
good? We keep putting words in your mouth.
That's what you meant.
I appreciate that.
This is regardless of cost, we're just going to sandbag anybody's house that gets within 20 feet of an escarpment? Is that what we're
That's the
saying?
motion.
Yeah, and I think what we determined earlier on, if I heard this right, we're talking maybe up to $30,000 or so per house, and if it's 7 or 8 houses, then we may have $210,000, $240,000.
I mean, that's if you're using the newish bags, yeah.
Our most recent rough quote was about $35,000 per lot. I think we would take off close to $10,000 per lot if we use the other bags, which, again.
Can I suggest that we use the cheaper bags?
I would agree, given the time frame that we're talking about.
If we only need them for 2 months,
All right, let's,
will they hold up?
let's include in the motion that we'll use the less expensive solution.
Is that Katie?
Yeah, that's Katie.
Scott, you need better motions, man. This is just.
I know, I'm
going
all
and
over the
going,
map
man.
here today, aren't I? All right, let me try to succinctly say this. I make a motion that the city approve the sandbagging project for the people that were in the 20 feet. That number may move from the current 7 or so up to 10. Whoever qualify, we're looking at a price tag approximately $25,000 per head, per household there, which if at 10 would be approximately $250,000 if I'm correct.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Hang on, we need a second.
I second.
Oh,
All right.
sorry.
All right, Katie, go ahead.
Is the scraping and bringing in sand going to prohibit us from adding sandbags? Like, is it now going to be not within 20 feet? Like, could we do too good of a job and then we don't?
Just wait a week.
I guess what.
I'm trying to look at the worst case, not worst, but whatever. Just looking at this from all sides. That just occurred to me.
And Stephen, you can chime in. I guess what you said earlier is that with our current scraping efforts, that we would fortify the berm in front of those properties before placing the sandbags so that they have a better chance at protection at that point.
Yeah, I think we would try to place as much sand as we can while still being able to place the bags. So we'll try to walk that line as best we can.
Okay, so the state's not going to come in and say, oh, now that you've put all this sand in here, you can't, now you're 22 feet, so you can't use the sandbags.
I hope not.
Yeah.
But I don't think so.
Blair.
But once the sandbags are placed, then we're done.
Right. You won't
Correct.
be scraping anymore.
Yeah, once the
Yeah.
sandbags are
Correct.
placed, we're not authorized to place additional sand in front.
And this motion
Right,
is
right.
without limit. We're not putting any cap on this. It's an open spend.
No, I said $250,000, I think is what I
Well,
put in there. But,
you did and you didn't. You said, well, if they're 10, then it'd be $250,000. Well, what if they're
Well,
100?
we can put it, if we need to go above $250,000, then let's have the council revisit. I'm fine with that.
Okay, so your motion as a cap of spending no more than $250,000.
Sounds good.
Scott, that's the longest motion in the history of council.
So a not to exceed,
I'll try not to make it any longer.
approval of a not to exceed 250,000 for sandbagging
That's a
those
good point.
properties that meet the emergency threshold. All right.
And do we have to say anything about the removal of those, or that's you guys all? get
Well,
that taken care of?
this
It's
would
a
be
city,
a
so
city
you got
project,
it.
so the city would be
Yep.
responsible for maintaining and removing them
Yeah.
before the project.
And that is a state condition, so we
Right.
don't have a choice.
Choice to that.
Motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Maybe somebody needs to take a crack at the third motion, otherwise we'll be here all day.
Desiree, did you get that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So that's the emergency ordinance, that's the sandbag. So now we're on to the
Scraping.
scraping / trucking, however we get. And Stephen, your recommendation was to put that in a dollar amount, not necessarily a cubic yard amount?
I think so, because we're going to have to base it off of what's available out there
Yeah.
in this bid.
And how much you get out of the, yeah.
And again, to the question earlier, if we get to a point where there's a sufficient dune that we need to put the bags in front of, that kind of stops that effort at that point.
What's that cost per hour to do that?
Right now, for 4 pieces of equipment, it's $1,200 per hour. They're able to work about 6 hours a day, so about $7,500 a day. I worked that out, what I think that's probably about $4 to $5 per cubic yard of sand. And then the trucking option was about $40 per cubic yard.
And Stephen, did your hours, your estimated hours that they're working, does include them working on both tide cycles?
It doesn't matter.
It's just-
I mean, as far as we're paying them by the hour, whether they work one cycle or two cycles.
But your estimate of 75 is assuming that they're working both.
That's assuming one tide cycle, so 6 hours on, 3 hours before and 3 hours after. each
Okay.
low tide.
But they've been working for the past several days on both
Both
tide
tides,
cycles, so it's been more expensive for the past few days. We're trying to get ahead of it.
The prior ones have only been using a
The
couple of
bulldo-
dozers,
the
though, so
dozer.
it's $300 an hour per piece of equipment.
Yeah.
So as we're adding equipment. it's-
Gotcha.
And I was going to say, on the funding side of this as well, I know we went to, and got some help from Senator Campson and the other funding, and I think there was $850,000 in that fund. It sounds like that we could and should be able to apply for additional funding if that is required. I'm not sure how all the funding is, is that something we should include in the motion too?
Yes, I mean, I think that an efforts to get state
matching
funding,
funds.
matching funding for that. Just for the record for you all, when council approved the trucking project, and we did obtain $150,000 from the state to cover 50% of the construction cost for that project, we pivoted and went through an emergency order, emergency scraping. That work will be reimbursable by FEMA because it was a declared disaster. So we still have not used or even received any of the funding from the original project as it had been anticipated at the time. I believe that it is in the city's best interest to get reimbursement from FEMA at a 75-25% share for the emergency work, and then go back to the state with a revised application for our new effort and get additional funds and potentially up to 50% of matching. They only have available 800. But that would be our goal, and we would be certainly pursuing that.
So our 25%, we would go after that for the matching funds, you're saying?
No, the 25% of the FEMA project, of the emergency project, that would be under the, that would be on,
Has to come
onto
out
the
of the city
city.
side.
I'm talking about what we're doing now
Right.
in excess of just the emergency piece, that we get 50% of that from the state.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
So did we have a motion?
No, we don't have a motion.
don't
So
know
let
what
me- you
dollar
want me to
amount yet.
try?
I think the
want me to
motion
try?
would,
Go
yeah.
ahead, John.
I'd like to make a motion that we approve up to $1 million or $1.25 million of funding to a combination of scraping sand and hauling in new dry sand to target 50,000 cubic yards of new fresh sand and apply for state matching funding with the state.
Second?
You'll have to reword that,
And we'll
but
let that catch up, yeah.
that's kind of got the items, I think, the key items in it.
You good?
I
Go ahead,
have
Desiree.
to approve an amount not to exceed $1,250,000 for a combination of scraping and trucking in sand with a target of placing 50,000 cubic yards of sand in the project area and apply for state matching funds.
I think that's it.
Jan?
Okay. Is that what we estimate that it would cost?
Yes.
I think that's a reasonable number with the combination of the scraping and
Okay,
and then hauling.
that's all.
With an understanding that there's no guarantee how long that sand is going to
Yeah.
be
And
in place.
that was the same thing with Adelia, so.
And just to clarify, the 250 for the sandbagging project is in addition to this motion that's approving 1.25?
Separate motion.
Okay. I think I got the motion down.
I think you do.
You all do?
So, Mr.
Go
Mayor,
ahead.
so this would completely, if all this money is spent, deplete the renourishment fund that we currently have. There'd be
No.
nothing left.
We have about 8 million.
We have
I thought we had
8.9.
1.8
No, we had 9 million.
We have 8.9 million as of today in
In
that
the-
fund.
in that fund, okay.
Beach preservation, yeah. Thank you, Blair.
And if we are successful in getting 50% of that 1.25, that would put us in a better position.
Yeah.
For sure.
Good, Russell.
Yeah, I know we can't, predict or guarantee if we get those matching funds, but what's been our history there? Do we think that we have a good chance of getting some of this recouped?
We've been very successful at getting grants over the
Yeah.
past several
Yeah.
years, so I am hopeful that we,
Right.
I mean, FEMA.
I mean, I know there's no
definitely-
guarantees, what I'm saying.
That's
but-
right.
But our history has been that we've been pretty successful at recouping some of that.
Yeah, and just for clarity, FEMA, it's not a given, but it's a given. The question's really about the state side of it.
Okay.
Scott?
My last question is, if we do all this, do you feel relatively confident that this is going to get us to the major project?
I do. I feel like the sandbags are your best moderate solution to guarantee that. If it was sand alone, I'd be nervous as we get into November and December with a nor'easter. That, again, there may be sand in the system, but it may not be up in the dune where it would prevent additional loss of that upland area. So I think that approach is a pretty sound approach.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Kevin?
Opposed? Yeah. Aye. Thank you. Any opposed?
Kevin, I think, oh, no, he said
He said
aye.
aye, yeah. Desiree, does that?
yes, sir, thank you.
And Stephen, could you, when you're there, can you just speak to, because I know I've had some exchanges, I'm sure others have too, around, folks that are looking across Breach Inlet to Sullivan's Island with the fort-like fortification that's there. Can you just talk to that briefly about how that's been allowed? I know some of it's before the Beachfront Management Act, and just kind of speak to that if you don't mind.
Yeah, all those revetments are prior to the Beachfront Management Act, so there's been no new seawalls allowed since that was passed in the 80s. So anything like that, they are allowed to maintain it, they are allowed to repair it if it's damaged less than 50%, but nothing like that type of thing would be allowed within OCRM's jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I suggest that at that workshop, we discuss a little longer-term potential solution, and that's what it would take to evaluate the rechanneling of Breaches Inlet? Because right now, I think that's the root cause of what we're seeing with the inlet closing, and we got the erosion coming across the face of our beach. And it's a much more difficult problem because you open it up, it causes problems somewhere else. And just the process of developing an engineering solution or a potential solution for that. I mean, is that something we can at least discuss at a workshop?
Stephen, you'll have an engraved invitation for Tuesday. You're in, pal.
Get your nameplate, yeah.
Sounds good, put it on the calendar.
Yeah, and, yeah, we can talk about it. Blair, sorry, did you? That's good. No, just real quick, this conversation about the beach, the sandbags and stuff, we also did scraping up at the Beechwood East area, which I know that's a whole different animal on where the line is, and it's a very different beast, and I get it. But potentially that water is within 20 feet of those structures as well. So I mean, what we've just approved, we didn't say site specific, but I just know we need to keep that on our radar too. And we were having attempting to have conversations with the community association up there just to see what's going on, but just to keep that in mind. I mean, again, that's 8 structures, and not all of them are within 20 feet. It's just, somewhere in there. So just food for thought. There being no further business.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?